Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yulia Ivanyuk, and I'm the coordinator of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that are made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you to the Center's lecture series. The theme of our webinar today is Civilian Volunteering During the Donbas War in Ukraine. Please note that our discussion is being video recorded, and we will be posting this session on our social media later on. So feel free to submit your questions into the chat box, and we'll try to do our best to address as many of them as possible in the Q&A. And finally, I'm really honored to introduce and welcome Dr. Nataliia Stepaniuk, who is the Center's 2022-23 Petro Jacyk Post-Doctoral Fellow. The purpose of the Petro Jacyk Fellowship at the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies is to annually support one of the most promising junior scholars studying Ukraine or Ukrainian Canadiana, and thereby to advance understanding of the Ukrainian politics, history, and society. Nataliia did her doctoral studies in political science at the University of Ottawa here in Canada. Her research focuses on the rise of civilian volunteer networks amidst war in Donbas, Ukraine. Nataliia's broader research interests include post-communist politics, civil society, gender politics, citizenship studies, and demilitarization. Nataliia also holds an MA from the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and an MA from the National Academy of Ostroh University. Outside of academic work, Nataliia is actively involved in community work, volunteering for the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, Ottawa Branch, and participating in various community-led initiatives. Nataliia, the digital floor is all yours.
Thank you so much to you, Yulia, and to the Center of Ukrainian Canadian Studies for hosting this event. It's my pleasure to have an opportunity to speak to you today and share some of my insights about civilian wartime volunteering in Ukraine. I'd like to start by saying that the efforts of the civilian volunteer movement in Ukraine is on full display these days. As I'm delivering this talk, Russia has been waging a full-scale war against Ukraine and Ukrainians for over 293 days. And over the last 9 months, we've seen countless Ukrainians coming together to support the military, procure for soldiers, address the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Ukraine because of the war, assisting injured soldiers and those injured in residential areas as well. So there has been a lot of astonishment and admiration with the resilience of Ukrainians, their ability to mobilize very quickly and efficiently in the face of this very shocking and disturbing reality of war. So in today's talk, I'd like to look into this civilian and volunteer phenomena in Ukraine and kind of bring us to the origins of it, looking a few years back in time to show how the civilian efforts that we are seeing today are built on the back of the civilian volunteer movement that emerged in 2013, the time when Russia annexed Crimea and then the subsequent violent developments in the Donbas region followed. More specifically, I'd like to talk about the emergence of civilian volunteer networks during the Donbas war, looking at the socio-political situation on the ground and motivations of individuals to get involved and volunteer. I will also want to provide a few examples of the networks that emerged at that time and discuss how they operated. I then want to talk about the demographic profile of volunteers, looking at who got engaged, their socioeconomic characteristics, kind of touching on the factors that made volunteering so successful in the time of war. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about different types of social processes, social learning, bonding, that occurred at that time, and make some connections about the current moment where we find ourselves, current efforts of civilians to address the multiple and very traumatic reality of war. Before I delve into it, I wanted to mention that my remarks are based on the ethnographic fieldwork that I conducted in Ukraine in 2015 in cities of Kharkiv, Odessa, and Dnipropetrovsk back then. Along with doing participant observation of volunteer work, I also collected about 95 interviews with civilians involved in different aspects of volunteering. And in today's talk, I would really want to highlight the lived experiences of volunteers, share some of their stories and their thinking at the time to give you a better sense of the dynamics and developments on the ground. Moving on to the first point of my talk, the emergence of volunteer networks and what motivated people to volunteer their time, considerable personal resources, and often put their lives at risk to help out with the war effort. I think this question is interesting in and of itself, how communities mobilize in times of war, but it's even more interesting in the context of southern and eastern Ukraine. And this is because these regions have been characterized historically by political scientists as, lacking in the capacity for mobilization, as being passive and disengaged, as having this ambiguous national identification. So when the war broke out in the Donbas region, we saw these communities mobilizing very quickly and efficiently, and this came as a surprise to many. And so more mainstream accounts attributed this mobilization to an upsurge of patriotism and this national awakening in these regions, as something that enabled very quick and efficient mobilization. However, drawing on my interviews and participant observation of volunteer work back in 2015, I noted a very different dynamic and very different reality on the ground, and this is something that I wanted to highlight in my talk. So many of the volunteers that I interviewed talked extensively about their fears at that time, about the future of their regions, about violence breaking out in their home cities, and this is something that really motivated them to get engaged. So when I conducted interviews, a lot of my respondents talked about the developments of 2013, and as some of you might recall, that was the time of great instability in southern and eastern Ukraine. Right after the annexation of Crimea happened, there were these narratives of re-establishing Novorossiya, this historical geographic region that covered southern and eastern Ukraine during the Russian Empire in the 19th century, and those narratives were spreading across these regions. There were also attempts to create a Kharkiv People's Republic and Odessa People's Republic, sort of mirroring the developments in the Donbas region, with the creation of so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. So my respondents were really concerned about that. They also talked about large pro-Russian rallies organized in their cities at that time. For example, Odessa saw a large rally in early March, numbering in over 10,000 people. So there was a lot of social and political tensions simmering in these regions, and my respondents talked how that made them very, very, very anxious about the future, about their future and the future of their families. And along with that, we also saw the buildup of Russian troops at the border with the Kharkiv Oblast and then in Transnistria. So many of my respondents referred to their security concerns as something that motivated them to get engaged. And one of them, and I quote here, said that, when somebody asked me why I helped the military, I responded, I'm scared that the war would start here. I try to contribute to the best of my ability to constrain the war and not let it spread. I'm truly scared for my children. I'm not an oligarch and I can't leave Ukraine and wait it out. Another of my respondents said that, people were killed on the streets of our city. Cars were set on fire. We witnessed it firsthand, and we understood perfectly well that war could break out here. And in fact, it did break out here, but lasted just for a few hours. That was an interview that I recorded in Kharkiv. So as we see, those security concerns were a very strong motivating factor for people to get involved. And in the absence of this readily available, infrastructure for social mobilization, the security concerns acted as a mobilizing force in a way. So people talked about how they were ready to join the underground resistance movement in the event of Russia's invasion back then, how they set up a meeting point to get together if Russia invaded, and other preparations that were underway. But all these efforts eventually transformed into supporting the military and trying to constrain the violence and war in the Donbas region. Another theme that came repeatedly in my interviews with volunteers is, and something that motivated them to get engaged, has to do with the spatiality of war itself, because Kharkiv, Dnipro allocated very close to the Donbas region where the fighting was occurring. These cities, harbored a lot of war-related needs. So oftentimes, if someone is injured on the front, they would be brought to the Kharkiv military hospital or to Odessa for emergency assistance before being transferred in a different hospital somewhere else. Same thing with military equipment repair. A lot of it would be brought to Kharkiv for repair. So these regions saw a lot of war-related needs that needed to be addressed. And there was a lack of the state's capacity to take care of these needs. And this also refers to needs created by displacement. As you can see on the map, in August of 2015, over 1.4 million individuals got displaced, mostly from the Donetsk region, but also from Crimea. And if you look at the distribution of that displacement, a lot of people moved to the neighboring regions. So Kharkiv accepted close to 200 displaced individuals, 200,000 displaced individuals. Dnipropetrovsk accepted close to 90,000 displaced individuals, and these numbers are much higher compared to the rest of Ukraine. For example, Ternopil accepted 2,700 displaced individuals. And so that uneven displacement created so-called pockets of heightened precarity, and created a lot of demand on the local infrastructure, on healthcare services, on different types of assistance that these displaced individuals needed at that time, and no one was providing that. So some of my respondents said that they really identified with the needs of the displaced population, and they imagined themselves been in a similar situation when they would be displaced and they wouldn't have a place to go, and so they responded to that by getting engaged and helping out. And one of my respondents sort of summarized the sentiment at that time by saying that I imagined a situation when I can't stay at home anymore and have to flee my baby to a place where I have neither relatives nor acquaintances. I have no savings, and the likelihood is high that I didn't bring documents with myself. All I can carry is my child, a cell phone, and some food that would feed us for a day. Where would I go? So a lot of people responded to the precarity of the displaced people, took their sort of perspectives, and that is something that motivated them to get engaged. And I wanted to highlight these two reasons for engagement because they're often missed in more classical accounts of civilian mobilization and how that occurs in time of crisis. So in response to this looming uncertainty in the regions, heightened precarity, and states lacking capacity to respond to these war-related needs, different types of volunteer networks emerged. And I'd like to just briefly talk about two examples, the networks that I studied closely during my fieldwork, and one of them is the station Kharkiv. So this volunteer network emerged in Kharkiv in June of 2014 to aid those fleeing violence from Donbas. And one of the first steps taken by volunteers was setting up the assistance booths at the train station where displaced individuals could receive immediate help, clothing, food, and so on. But then very quickly, volunteers started providing different types of support, including, short-term shelters for the most vulnerable groups, single mothers, disabled individuals. Then they started providing legal counseling. They started helping out IDPs with employment and so on. So we see this diversification of service provision in volunteer networks, and that resulted in a lot of also knowledge gain. A lot of volunteers talked how they acquired considerable knowledge on issues related to IDPs, for example, or they acquired a considerable knowledge related to how state institutions function, how local bureaucracies function. So there was a lot of learning occurring in volunteer networks at that time. And another thing that I want to highlight is that when I came to the field in 2015 to conduct my field work, these networks were managed to develop a lot of partnerships with local, regional, and international organizations, including the UNHCR, USAID, and so on. They also built relationships with diaspora communities across the world. And so there was, they really branched out and built strategic alliances to be able to better assist the displaced. And so here we can see this sort of like development that has to do with the institutionalization of grassroots initiatives, something that is, I think, very important for us to also understand the current state of volunteer efforts. Another initiative that I wanted to highlight is the volunteer network called Sotnya Dalii Severin. So the squad of Dalia Severin, and Dalia is the fictitious name that the lead volunteer adopted at that time, because some volunteers didn't want to use their true names because first it wasn't safe enough, and then for other reasons as well. So Sotnya Dalii Severin was formed in Odessa in June of 2014. And it began as a fundraising initiative for CUCS. And when I talked to the lead volunteer in that network, she said that she was really shocked by the fact that soldiers and volunteer battalion fighters were sent to the front with close to nothing provided. And one time she just saw photos on Facebook showing the precarity of military service at that time. And the situation back in 2014 was really dire. And so she took it upon herself to just, fundraise for socks. But very quickly, this initiative grew in size and attracted other women eager to help. So in 2015, when I attended some of their volunteer events, they were sending these care packages to the front, trying to provide basic necessities to soldiers, including, coffee, tea, cigarettes, hygiene products, and so on. And one interesting thing that I observed at that time is that there was a lot of thought and care put into the packaging itself, let's say, making sure that each package had a note of gratitude, some sort of encouragement sent to those on the front. You can see it on the slide, one of the photos that I took during the field work. And in conversation with mostly female volunteers engaged in these initiatives, they said that they see that aspect of volunteering as very important, providing emotional support, encouragement, expressing gratitude for military service. And so that sort of emphasizes the amount of emotional labor that went into volunteering. And this is often left invisible, even though feminist scholarship discusses it in great extent, how that kind of emotional labor is very important for the functioning of militaries, and how militaries by and large rely on women's unpaid labor to maintain the health and morale of soldiers, to keep the enlistment rates high. And so this is also something that that was happening in Ukraine, and this development is really not unique. This gendered pattern of civilian mobilization in wartime. And then when we look at the numbers, talking a little bit about the demographic profile of volunteers, we see that this is also reflected in the overrepresentation of women in volunteer networks. So out of 95 individuals that I interviewed, 2/3 of them were women. And this is not because I preferred interviewing women, it's just really that they were overrepresented at different levels of volunteering, both in leadership roles, but also supporting roles. And some volunteer initiatives, like cooking battalions or knitting squad battalions, hospital volunteer networks, were female-only initiatives where women took it upon themselves to support soldiers, to provide emotional care for them, to engage in trauma mediation, and so on. And many of my respondents saw that kind of work as naturally belonging to women's sphere of responsibility. This is what women are supposed to do. We are supposed to support men. We're just better, like, naturally equipped to attend to the emotional needs of others. So there was that gendered understanding of responsibility in wartime, and this is something that also drove and sustained volunteer engagement on the ground. And one thing that I noted is that not only these gendered norms drove volunteer engagement, but they also volunteering engagement in and of itself reinforced these traditional gender norms, with some women saying that, well, we used to think that women and men are similar, but we no longer think that way. We see that our roles are different, and the role of women is really to support men. So in that sense, there was that dynamic or development with women embracing more traditional gender norms in the course of volunteer work. Another interesting another interesting development that has, or another interesting thing to highlight about the demographic profile of volunteers is that many of the people who got involved were small or medium level entrepreneurs. So they reported having a business of some sort or been self-employed and been engaged in entrepreneurship and so on. And that referred both to men and women involved in volunteering. And I think this is something that made volunteering so effective in Ukraine, because there was this transfer of skills and competencies from entrepreneurs who turned volunteers. So they really capitalized on their not only personal resources, but on their business connections, on their knowledge of how to interact with local bureaucracies, how to manage people, how to do large-scale procurements, how to organize the logistics of everything. And they transferred those skills into volunteering, something that made it more effective. They were able to respond to the needs on the ground very, very quickly. And that overrepresentation of small and medium entrepreneurs was especially visible among lead volunteers. Out of 38 lead volunteers in charge of volunteering efforts, 21 had this entrepreneurial background. There were, of course, other occupations involved in volunteering as well, but I found this to be really fascinating and important for us to reflect on how, entrepreneurship enabled that very efficient mobilization in wartime. Another thing that I wanted to highlight about the demographic profile of volunteers is that the vast majority of them were new to this type of work. 90% of my respondents reported that they were not previously engaged in any community affairs, in any, political affairs or like public life at large. They said that before the war and during Maidan as well, they primarily focused on their families, on their friends, on their careers, and that was it. So the war was a rupture to their ways of life, something that moved them out of the private into the public arena and made them participate in different ways. And I think this is important for us to reflect how wars can really bring about change, also in a sense that they maybe make people think differently about their responsibilities as citizens. They make people relate differently to others around them. They can expand the social circles and connections that people have, and sort of result in different forms of social bridging and bonding, something that occurs in wartime. On that aspect, kind of like conceptualizing war as a time of rupture, but also as a time of change, I wanted to emphasize some of the processes that I observed happening in volunteer networks. And I think these processes are significant also for the current volunteer effort in Ukraine. So one thing that kind of came out in my conversations is that a lot of these volunteers had to travel continuously to the front and also to other regions of Ukraine to be able to provide the assistance, and how that heightened increased interregional mobility resulted in increased interregional cohesion. So people started making connections across Ukraine. They started learning about other parts and cities of Ukraine, and that in a way changed their thinking, helped them to get away from some of the regional stereotypes that existed in Ukraine prior to war and perhaps still persist. But again, there was this development that there was a lot of interregional mobility that resulted in improved interregional cohesion and interregional bonding. Another important development is that the new solidarities that emerged at that time in those war spaces between the civilian and military populations. And, with volunteers having to constantly travel to the front, they made a lot of friendships, acquaintances with the soldiers. And so there was this newly acquired appreciation of the military as an institution and of soldiers also as a vocation. Some of my respondents said that before the war, they didn't really think much of the military. They thought of soldiers as, like beggars asking for a cigarette. They didn't have a lot of respect for the institution and for soldiers, but the war really changed that. And as I noted before, these new solidarities between the civilian and military populations were gendered in a sense that it was mostly female volunteers supporting, male soldiers. So we see that gendered bonding occurring between the civilian and military populations. A few other things to note before I end and open it up for the discussion is that a lot of my respondents also talked about overcoming a sense of powerlessness through volunteer work. Many of them said that previously they didn't really think it was important to be engaged. They didn't think that their actions mattered. There was this disillusionment that was characteristic of the post-Soviet Ukraine, I guess. But then many of them said that through volunteering, they met like-minded people. They realized that their actions matter. They saw the results of their efforts. And this is something that really helped them to overcome that sense of powerlessness. It was an empowering feeling. They felt a sense of pride for their work and the work of their fellow volunteers, and that is an important, I think, development that happened during that time. And also in the course of volunteering, they also increased their sense of belonging to the local communities. Again, talking about meeting like-minded people, that there are so many great people around us. We just have to make sure that we work together, cooperate, but also increased national identification. Some of my respondents said that before the war, we didn't really identify with Ukraine, or we didn't really thought of the army as our state institution, but the war changed that, and they really it created this or strengthened that identification at the national level, and I think it was really significant for those regions. And I guess to wrap up, I just wanted to say that I think that the developments of that time and the social processes, learning, bonding, interregional cohesion that happened during that phase of volunteering is really important, and this is something that enables current volunteer efforts and also contributes to the resilience of these regions to withstand in the face of this absolutely horrific war and Russia's brutality in Ukraine. So I'd like to end on this note. This has been a very brief sort of recap of my observations back from 2015. I'd be happy to delve into some of these themes a little bit more during the Q&A part of our discussion. So over to you, Yulia.
Thank you so much, Natalia. It was so informative, and I think that there's a lot to explore here. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions after such a intellectually stimulating talk. Feel free to continue submitting your questions into the Q&A chat box if you'd like. And in the interim, I'll ask a question that I was personally wondering about. So my question is twofold. When we are speaking about volunteerism as of 2014, self-organization has been seen as catalyst for change and in many ways a challenge for the state to reform. Could you please address the similarities and differences between the Revolution of Dignity and the post-invasion self-organization or volunteering movements? And did volunteerism lead to reformation or changes in a relationship between the individuals, civil society, and the state? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for the question. It's a big question. There are many different dimensions to it. So I'll start by answering by speaking to the second part of your question, whether volunteering sort of resulted in the in reforming the relationships between individuals and civil society and the state. So I think one of the biggest change that occurred during that time is that again that has to do with the way volunteers related to each other and their communities and the nation as a whole. I mentioned towards the end of my presentation that many of the people that I interviewed said that they felt disengaged prior to the war. They just cared about their private life, about their families, and that was about it. They perhaps donated once in a while to a charity initiative, but they didn't feel the need to participate more actively. So the war and their experience of volunteering really changed that. They realized that it's very important to get engaged. They realized that there are a lot of people around them who want to see change happen, and they saw themselves as agents of that change. So I think first that change in perception about their own role as citizens is a very important development. Then building a more positive outlook around about the society and the communities within which they live is also very important. And also identifying again with state institutions on a deeper level, again, thinking of the Ukrainian army not just as an army, but their army, so, the institution that they have to support, and they have to invest to make sure that it's functional. And it also was visible in their attitudes towards other state institutions, bureaucracies. So they talked a lot about, the issues and problems that they encountered while interacting with these institutions, but they also started taking responsibility for that, that it's our responsibility to change, it's our responsibility to fight with corruption, it's our responsibility to reform. So I think it's a very significant development. To what extent that is going to translate into meaningful and lasting change and in reforms, I think we're seeing some of it right now with volunteers sort of like joining state institutions, going into politics, even though I have to say that back in 2015, when I collected my data, there was this unwillingness for volunteers to go into politics specifically, because they felt like they've acquired a lot of social legitimacy through their work, and they felt bad sort of like using that legitimacy for political gains. That was the thinking at the time, that politics is still a dirty business. We want to do good, we want to volunteer, we want to support others, but we don't want to go into politics. But I did note some shifts in thinking around that and discussions that were happening. Is it a good thing for volunteers to go into politics? Is it something that volunteers should stay away from? So I think that just that experience generated a lot of new discussions. And some of them, a lot of them are still, I guess, ongoing, because that social change, it takes time. In terms Yeah, so I think we can we can think of volunteer movement as a catalyst of change. What kind of shape that change is going to take? We're still it's in flux. You know, it's still unfolding, but there have been some positive developments in terms of new actors being involved in politics and in civil society. You know, new grassroots organizations being built that have a lot of know-how, knowledge, and they're really attached to the realities on the ground. So I think, yeah, we can definitely think of these networks in that way.
Thank you, Nataliia. I know that nobody knows the future, but I'm still really interested in picking your brain on this one. So do you think that the lack of interest in joining political scene by the volunteers is caused by the mistrust of the authorities? And do you think that the self-organization and volunteerism will eventually transform into some sort of political movements, parties, or interest groups? Do you think that there is an interest in becoming a stronger part of the state, and how will the developments of the war of 2022 affect these processes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is definitely the distrust of authorities and the politics in general. This very negative perception about politicians, that these are people who are corrupted, who go into politics for their personal gains, was still very present, at least in 2015, and this acted as a barrier for volunteers to get involved politically. I did encounter some cases when volunteers wanted to go into politics, but they were criticized by other volunteers for, you know, oh, this is all about politics. You just so your volunteering efforts were for personal gains, actually. So there was that. It acted as a deterrence mechanism in a way, like those narratives for volunteers to go and explore other areas of work. In terms of whether we are going to see the volunteer movement transform into, you know, into other forms and shapes, I think this is already occurring. Some volunteer organizations that took care of internally displaced individuals transformed into advocacy groups, sort of voicing the needs of this category of people. The same can be said about volunteers helping out the military. You know, initially they provided just material support, but then they started advocating on behalf of the military. You know, raising their concerns to authorities at different levels, and really being the voice for the military. One thing that I'd note is that volunteer networks are really diverse. They attract people with different with different views and perceptions about politics. So I think that diversity is also going to be visible as the volunteer movement evolves. You know, because some people. Women, you know, knitting camouflage nets, for example, they said that we just want to support, we want to care for the soldiers, we don't want to do anything beyond that. We see the need for the kind of work that we're doing, and for as long as that work is needed, we will continuing, you know, cooking for the military or attending to the injured at hospitals, and that would be it. But other volunteers started thinking a little bit more strategically. They said that we see the volunteer movement as filling the gaps, where at the time when the state couldn't just provide for the populations that needed support most, but eventually we want the volunteer movement to sort of drain itself into oblivion. We don't want to exist anymore. We want state institutions and authorities function well and provide the services as needed. So they started like turning their gaze towards state building, I guess, and finding ways to influence what was happening there, not necessarily getting involved directly, but still contributing to those discussions, and sometimes even again switching from volunteering into other types of work, becoming going and changing the bureaucracies from within.
Thank you, Nataliia, for your thoughtful reflection. And we have a comment from Oresa Kulak. She's mentioning that she's heard political scientists speaking often about how Ukrainian volunteer networks augment, or in some cases substitute, expand state capacity. And as a historian, she finds this information to be very abstract. How do you see the relationship between volunteer networks and the Ukrainian government from the perspective of your own ethnographic research?
So I can speak to the realities and developments of 2015 and 14. And what I can say is that kind of like to put it in in more precise terms, not to be very abstract about it. Well, when volunteer networks emerged, they emerged independently of state involvement. You know, they didn't want to cooperate. They didn't see the need for it, so they just tried to provide assistance where they saw the need, and that was happening in parallel with let's say state actions, or state involvement, but their actions did contribute to state building in a way, just supporting the military, even providing food, providing very basic supplies that still ensured that the military, the state institution, was able to function and operate during the wartime. And I mean something very basic, even like I encountered instances where volunteers would not only deliver food and socks, sometimes would deliver toilet paper, or would deliver, and then eventually they started delivering more complex military equipment as well. This is a huge assistance to the state itself. We can talk about this type of work as state building work conducted by volunteers, even if they didn't necessarily position themselves in that way. And what is important is that a lot of that work was also done by women. So women, while cooking for the military, that was their way to ensure the functioning of the military, to ensure that the military would be able to operate. And I think this is something that is not always acknowledged, how female labor is used for the state building purposes. It's always regarded as less, I don't know, significant, less important, not visible. But in the context of Ukraine, it was really key for the state survival at that time, I'd say.
Thank you, Nataliia. And I have a question based on personal observation. I got a sense that the gender representation of the volunteer movement has changed between 2014 and 2022, with more males joining the volunteer movement today. Does this sound like a reasonable proposition to you, or do your thoughts differ from this?
I think you're right, Yulia, and I think that also has to do with the large scale of much larger scale of displacement happening in Ukraine these days. That a lot of women, had to leave Ukraine for safety with their children. Their husbands were not able to join them abroad, so that kind of like limited in a way their ability to help out and volunteer, because they first have to navigate this new environment of living abroad, being a single parent, and that doesn't leave a lot of time and resources to get engaged voluntarily. While for men it's a little bit different. A lot of them had to stay in Ukraine and found ways to get engaged, if not through military service, then through volunteering against their time and their efforts. I think what we've seen right now is also that civilian mobilization on a much larger scale, where individuals just feel that they have to do something, and that relates both to men and women. But one thing that I would say is that the types of work that men and women undertake in their volunteering still differs, and it's shaped by gendered understanding of responsibility and roles. So again, women, while women still procure, we see women fundraising for drones and military equipment and doing really a huge variety of tasks in the context of volunteering. When it comes to some specific things like providing emotional care, for example, it would fall on the shoulders of women, and not just fall on the shoulders of women, but women would undertake that kind of work voluntarily because they see themselves as better able to provide that type of work. And again, I think even now, if we look at who takes care of the displaced individuals, for example, attends to their emotional needs and distress, I think we would still see these very like gendered patterns of involvement. So I think while the current full-scale war engaged more individuals, and maybe in terms of representation, it evened out the participation of men and women. At the same time, I think the way men and women engage is still different and is shaped by gender norms.
Thank you so much for providing gender-based analysis to this question. I would like to build up on Royce's previous question in the context of both 2014 and what was happening after 2014 and 2022. I was wondering if you have a sense as to what is the right balance between the volunteerism filling in the state's limitations, but at the same time still holding the government accountable and making sure that the institutional reform takes place? Or does this question become absolutely irrelevant if you're fighting for the right to exist, and we should not be engaging in these types of debates at this point of time, and pick a better time to talk about these types of matters?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this discussion is very important, and I think it is a good time to engage in that discussion, even though, you know, Ukraine is facing this existential threat. In terms of the right balance, I don't think there is really a formula of the right balance between on how civil society and civilians interact with state institutions, and what is the role of civilians in supporting state institutions. I think at some point what we are seeing right now, and the developments, it will result into the changed and it has resulted into the changed relationship between the state and citizens. What exactly is going to come out of this new reality? It's hard to tell. But what we see right now is that we often think about the state and civil society and citizens as separate entities. But what this experience of war shows to us is that there are so many interconnections, and the lines are very blurry, because someone who is today volunteering might join the state institution tomorrow to support in a different way. So there is a lot of movement and flux happening in that area, and that generates a lot of discussion in Ukrainian society, how these relationships, what kind of form and shape they should take going forward. And of course, civilians realized are also very much aware of their contribution towards this, the survival of the Ukrainian state as such and towards ensuring the functioning of different institutions. So they feel a sense of empowerment in a way, and that is going, I think, to shape the conversations going forward.
Thank you, Natalia. We know that there have been a lot of discussions about the identity question when it comes to Ukraine, and especially the differences between East and West. I was wondering if you have noticed any generational differences or perhaps similarities in view of identity among the groups that you were able to talk to, or perhaps there were any generational, not generational, but I shall say regional differences, or perhaps even religious lines that you have observed. Would be really curious to have you address that issue of identity and the issue of identifying with Ukraine and the Ukrainian state in a particular way. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the issue of identity, especially in the context of southern and eastern Ukraine and Ukraine more generally, is a very interesting one. It's also a very complex one, and there is a lot changing in that respect as well. What I was observing back in 2015, and I think that these processes are still unfolding in some ways, is that again, the previous ways people identified like in a way came into irrelevance. A lot of my respondents said that before the war, they didn't really think about it much. They also sometimes thought of themselves as belonging to this, like in terms of pan-Slavic identities, you know, that Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians are part of the same like Slavic group, and the war made that kind of thinking impossible for some of my respondents. And they said that we can no longer think about Ukrainians and Russians as being part of the same entity. We cannot think of them as, you know, as belonging to the same peoples, given what they've been doing to Ukraine. And so there was this shift from like pan-Slavic ways of identifying towards national identification of relating to Ukraine. Similar developments happen in terms of regional identifications. And since Ukraine became independent, we saw a lot of public surveys where people would actually, where regional identification would supersede the national identification, where people would identify more strongly with the regions of their residence compared to the state, and that has changed. And for example, some respondents that I talked to from Odessa said that, well, we used to think of ourselves as Odessa residents. We're Odessite, you know, or we're, there was one IDP woman I talked to, and she said that I always thought of myself as Luhanchanka, the resident of Luhansk. But I no longer think that in that way, that local identity has lost its relevance for many individuals, because they've realized that because the issue was the survival of the state in a way in these regions, and so that brought about new ways of thinking and identifying with Ukraine a lot more than it used to be the case. And some people said that question, they just never thought of themselves in those terms. It was irrelevant, but again, the war made it very relevant for them in terms of national belonging and belonging with Ukraine. It also raised questions around language, because most of the people that I talked to were Russian speakers. I think out of 95 individuals, only 5 used Ukrainian as a language of everyday use, and they there was that question whether it was acceptable for someone who identifies with Ukraine to speak Russian on an everyday basis, or does that mean that eventually or even immediately they have to switch to Russian? And I think that conversation about language belonging and language identities, it's ongoing. I'd say that a good part of my respondents actually switched to Ukrainian or expressed the intention to switch to Ukrainian in the near future. but they also, in terms of generational shift, they said that they see it more of an issue for their generation because they were raised speaking Russian and they were schooled in Russian. But for their kids, it will no longer be an issue because their kids go to Ukrainian schools and they speak Ukrainian very well, and they themselves, their parents, see the need for them to speak Ukrainian. So it's not going to be an issue going forward. That was the perception on the ground.
Thank you, Natalia, for your reflections. And I just have one last question. So we know that two of the larger narratives that are being leveraged both inside of the Russian Federation and in the Russian-controlled so-called People's Republics are the ideas of the Russian world, the so-called Novorossiya that you have addressed in your presentation, and also the World War II mythology. Did this rhetoric come up in your research, and did the volunteers that you had a chance to interview offer any thoughts on this and thoughts on how these fallacious narratives might be tackled and best ways of moving forward that the people of those regions saw? Thank you.
This is also a very good question, and it did come up in conversation with volunteers, some sort of like that mythology around the Second World War and the Soviet Union, coming out as a winner in that war, and how some people said that it actually made them proud to belong to that space, and they identified with those mythologies before the war. But again, the war changed everything. They could no longer relate to that grandeur of the Soviet Union as a state. They moved away from that type of thinking. They also changed on the practical level. They stopped celebrating, February 23 as the day of the defender. That was the holiday that was established during the Soviet times. They moved away from it. Some people also talked about Holodomor, how these events made them reconsider what they know about that genocide by famine that happened in the 30s in Ukraine. And one volunteer actually shared a very touching story about her grandma telling her about the Holodomor experience and how Ukrainians and how there were attempts to exterminate Ukrainians at that time, and how she didn't believe her at that time, how she could, she found it very difficult to believe that someone would take away grain and food from villagers. But this new experience of war made her rethink and go back to those family stories and narratives and sort of like claim them as part of her history. And one last thing that I wanted to mention, I know that we are almost out of time, is that there was this new interest in learning about the history of Ukraine, but I found a lot of that learning was kind of like shaped by the understanding of Ukrainian history by Western regions. So volunteers, for example, from southern and eastern Ukraine would travel to Lviv or somewhere else, and they would purchase books there about Bandera or some other historical figures, and that's the type of learning and exchange that was occurring in this network. So they developed a bigger appreciation of Western regions as the cradle of nationalism in Ukraine, and they started relating to those let's say narratives about Ukrainian history. So there was a homogenization in a way of historical memory happening in the context of volunteering as well.
Thank you so much, Natalia, for this great presentation and for your analysis. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us here today. Just a brief reminder, we have 2 more reading club sessions left in this year on Thursday and Friday this week. And outside of that, please stay tuned for more events in the new year. And I hope that all of you have very good and happy holidays. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yulia. It's been a pleasure.